The man was used to being noticed the moment he entered a room. People stood straighter when he walked past. Conversations softened. Eyes followed him with respect, sometimes fear. He had earned that reaction over many years. His life was built on decisions that affected thousands of people. Companies rose or fell because of a single word from him. His calendar was always full, his phone never silent. His face almost never showed what he truly felt. That afternoon, he was supposed to be somewhere else. A meeting had ended early, and for once there was a gap in his schedule. He asked his driver to stop near a busy public square in the middle of the city. It was not a place he often visited. Too many people, too much noise, too many reminders of lives very different from his own. Still, something made him want to step out of the car and walk for a few minutes. The square was alive with movement. Street vendors called out to passersby. Buses hissed as they stopped and started again. Children ran between adults, laughing, chasing each other, free in a way he no longer understood. He stood near the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets, looking like just another well-dressed man waiting for time to pass. Inside, however, he felt heavy. The kind of heaviness that had nothing to do with age or tired muscles. It sat deep in his chest, growing stronger over the years. He had learned how to ignore it during meetings and public speeches. He buried it under success, under praise, under money. But in quiet moments like this one, it always found its way back. A few steps away from him, a small girl stood with her parent near a food cart. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old. She wore simple clothes that had been washed many times, but were still neat and clean. Her hair was tied back loosely, with a few strands falling across her face as she moved. She held a small paper bag with food inside, clutching it like it was something precious. The parent paid the vendor and turned to speak to someone nearby. Distracted for just a moment, the girl looked around the square, her eyes wide with curiosity. She noticed things adults often ignored. A bird hopping near a bench, an old man resting his legs, the tired look on the face of a woman carrying heavy bags. Then her eyes landed on the man standing alone at first. She only glanced at him. Something about him was different. Not his clothes or his posture, but the way he stood so still while the world moved around him. Most grown-ups looked busy or annoyed or lost in their phones. He looked empty. Not empty, like he had nothing. But empty, like he had too much, and none of it mattered. The man felt her eyes on him and looked down. Children rarely held his attention. They belonged to another part of life he had left behind long ago. Still, when their eyes met, he felt something unexpected. There was no fear in her gaze. No curiosity about his status. Just simple interest, the kind that came from innocence. He gave a small, polite nod, the kind he gave to strangers without thinking. She didn't nod back. She smiled. It wasn't a big smile or a forced one. It was quiet and honest, like she was happy just because she was alive in that moment. The man looked away quickly, unsure why it made him uncomfortable. He checked his phone. No new messages. No urgent calls. The silence annoyed him. It reminded him of evenings in his large house where every room echoed, where awards sat on shelves but no laughter filled the air. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and stared at the ground. The girl watched him again. She tugged gently on her parent's sleeve and whispered something. The parent nodded without really listening, still focused on the conversation. The girl took a small step forward, then another, until she was standing just a few feet away from the man. He noticed her shoes first. They were worn at the edges, clearly used for running and playing, not for show. Then he noticed the way she held her food bag, careful not to spill a single piece. When he looked up, she was right there, looking up at him. "Are you okay?" she asked. Her voice was soft but clear. Not loud enough to draw attention, but strong enough to be heard. The question caught him off guard. Adults didn't ask him that. They assumed he was always fine, always in control, always winning. "I'm fine," he replied automatically. The words came out smooth, practiced. She tilted her head slightly, studying his face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "You don't look fine," she said. He almost laughed. Almost, instead. He felt something tighten inside his chest. "That's just how my face looks," he said, trying to sound light. She didn't argue. She didn't push. She simply nodded, accepting his answer without judgment. Then she opened her paper bag and reached inside. She pulled out a small piece of food and held it out to him. "Here," she said. "It makes people feel better." He stared at her hand. For a moment, the noise of the square faded. He saw only the small fingers holding something meant for her. Something she was willing to give to a stranger without a second thought. "I don't need it," he said quietly. "That's okay," she replied. "You can still have it." Something about the way she said it broke through his defenses. There was no pressure in her voice. No expectation. Just kindness, freely given. He slowly took the piece of food from her hand. Their fingers brushed for a second. It was a small, human moment, but it felt heavy with meaning. "Thank you," he said. His voice lower than before. She smiled again, satisfied, and stepped back toward her parent. The interaction lasted less than a minute. No one around them seemed to notice. To the crowd, it was nothing. Just a child talking to a stranger. But for the man, it felt like something had shifted. He looked at the food in his hand and then at the girl, who was now happily eating and swinging her legs. He felt a strange warmth mixed with sadness. A memory surfaced, uninvited. A time long ago when he had been a child like her, offering something small to someone who needed it. A time when kindness came easily, before life taught him to protect himself. He swallowed hard and took a slow breath. He hadn't expected anything from this walk. Certainly not this. As the crowd continued to move around them, he realized that this was only the beginning of a moment he didn't yet understand. And somewhere deep inside, a wall he had built over many years had started to crack quietly. Without anyone noticing, the little girl had already moved on. Unaware that her simple question and small gesture had just stepped into a life weighed down by power, pressure, and loneliness. And the man stood there, changed in a way he couldn't explain, holding a piece of food and a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. The girl walked beside her parent, still holding the small paper bag of food she had purchased, but her mind lingered on the man she had spoken to just moments ago. Something about him had felt different from the other adults around her. He didn't scowl or frown at the noise of the square, and he didn't shove anyone aside. He simply stood there, quiet, as if carrying a weight invisible to everyone else. She didn't know why, but she felt like he needed a little light, even if he didn't admit it. The man, on the other hand, had not moved from the spot where they had briefly connected. He looked at the piece of food in his hand, and then at the crowd moving past him. People were laughing, talking, rushing to appointments or errands, and yet he felt completely alone despite the noise around him. It was strange. He had been surrounded by people all his life, commanding attention, making decisions that affected many, but he had rarely felt the way he did now, seen. Truly seen by someone so small, so innocent, and so unafraid. He slipped the food into his pocket. More for the comfort of holding on to the memory than for the peace itself. He wanted to linger in that feeling a little longer, but the reality of the world around him pressed in. The square was bustling, and people were moving without pause, unaware of the quiet shift happening to him. He realized he had spent so long moving through life without noticing these moments, without noticing anyone at all, that the simplest act of attention could feel overwhelming. As he stood there, he began to notice other small details he usually ignored. A man struggling with grocery bags, a mother trying to calm a crying baby, an old woman feeding pigeons from the corner of the square. Every scene seemed ordinary to the world, but to him, it was a stark contrast to his carefully structured life. Meetings, contracts, and deadlines had consumed him so fully that the richness of simple human moments had faded from his memory. Meanwhile, the little girl tugged gently on her parent's sleeve again, pointing toward a street performer playing a soft tune on a violin. The music floated through the air, almost unnoticed amid the square's usual chaos. The girl's face lit up, her eyes bright with delight. Her parent smiled faintly and held her hand, letting her pull them closer to the performer. She clapped lightly when a note lingered in the air. And then, as if remembering something, She glanced back, toward the man who had held her attention before. The man had shifted slightly. He was watching the crowd, but his gaze kept returning to the child. He didn't understand why he felt drawn to her so strongly. There was no logic, no professional reason. It was something raw, something he hadn't felt in years. He remembered a time from his own childhood when small gestures from others could change his entire day. And suddenly, he realized that he hadn't experienced that kind of kindness in decades. The girl hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward again. She didn't run or shout or draw attention. She simply approached, holding the paper bag close, her small hands careful not to spill a crumb. She stopped a few steps from him, looking up with wide, curious eyes. "You look like you have a lot on your mind," she said softly. The man blinked. Adults never spoke to him like that. They assumed he had it all under control, that his life was perfect because of the image he projected. But here was a child, standing calmly in front of him, acknowledging his humanity without fear or judgment. He wanted to respond casually, as he always did, but the words caught in his throat. "I'm okay," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. She studied him for a moment. Then, without hesitation, she offered another small piece of food from her bag. "Sometimes this helps," she said. The simplicity of her gesture, innocence behind it, struck him more deeply than anything anyone had said in years. It wasn't about the food. It was about attention, about recognition, about being seen as more than a title or a suit. It was about being treated as a human being, someone who mattered even without power or wealth. He took the food, holding it gently. Their fingers touched briefly, and he felt a shock of warmth he hadn't felt in decades. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. He realized he hadn't allowed himself to pause for a long time, hadn't allowed himself to notice life beyond meetings and profits. "Why are you being so nice?" he asked, almost whispering, more to himself than to her. "Because I can," she replied, her voice steady. "Everyone needs kindness sometimes." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. He felt tears sting his eyes, though he fought to blink them away. The crowd continued to move around them. People laughing, vendors calling, children playing. But he felt suspended in a private moment that no one else could touch. He wanted to speak, to explain, to tell her why it was unusual for anyone to care so openly about him. But he realized there was nothing to explain. This wasn't a business deal, a lesson, or a performance. It was a connection, raw and human. And he felt unprepared for how profoundly it affected him. The girl smiled again, sensing perhaps that he needed to collect himself. She nodded once and stepped back toward her parent. She didn't say goodbye, didn't linger for attention or thanks. She simply returned to her world, carrying her own simple joys and continuing through the square. The man remained where he was, holding the small piece of food and feeling something shift inside him. Memories he had long suppressed surfaced, evenings alone, the weight of expectations, the rare time someone had shown him real warmth. He realized he had buried those moments under his career and reputation, but they were still there, waiting. Fragile, yet persistent. A feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel for years began to rise. Hope. Not hope in business or money, but hope in people, in connection. In the simple possibility that the world still contained genuine kindness. He felt the tightness in his chest loosen, even if just slightly, and he took a deep breath. Noticing the world in ways he hadn't for decades, the street continued to bustle around him, but he no longer felt lost within it. He had glimpsed something small, a tiny spark of human warmth, and it was enough to crack open a heart that had long been closed. For the first time in many years, he felt seen, acknowledged, and reminded of the quiet power of small, thoughtful acts. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that this brief encounter, this simple exchange, would not leave him easily. It would follow him, quietly reshaping his thoughts, nudging him toward moments he had long ignored. And he would wonder, again and again, about the little girl who had reminded him that even someone as busy and powerful as he could still be touched, still be human, Still be reminded that kindness mattered. The man walked slowly through the square, the piece of food still in his pocket. He had never moved this slowly in a public place before. Usually, he was always on a schedule, always moving with purpose, every step calculated. But today, he found himself observing people as he walked, noticing things he had long stopped seeing. A woman sitting on a bench fed a small dog scraps from her sandwich. She didn't notice him, nor did she try to. She smiled quietly as the dog wagged its tail. A boy ran past him, holding a colorful balloon, and nearly collided with a vendor carrying a stack of cups. He chuckled softly, something that surprised him. Laughter had become rare in his life, a sound he often associated with someone else's happiness, not his own. He thought about the little girl again. Her innocent gaze, the way she had spoken without hesitation, without fear, without expectation. She had looked at him as though he were just another human being, someone who deserved kindness. The world often treated him as a problem to be managed, a force to be controlled, or an achievement to be measured. But she had treated him as a person, nothing more, nothing less. And in that treatment, he felt something stir deep inside, something he hadn't felt in decades. His mind wandered to memories he had carefully buried. He remembered sitting on a similar square as a child, clutching a small snack in his hand, looking around at the people moving past him. There had been moments of loneliness, moments of small kindness, moments that had shaped him in ways he had never acknowledged. The memory made his chest tighten and brought a lump to his throat. He realized that the world had made him forget those moments, that the busyness of adulthood had buried them under layers of duty, ambition, and pride. He saw a man struggling to open a heavy door for himself and a child following close behind. Normally, he would have walked past without noticing. Today, he stepped forward and held the door open. The man inside barely thanked him, too, caught up in his own life. But that didn't matter. The act itself felt different. Small, yes. But it carried a sense of human connection he had almost forgotten existed. He sat on a nearby bench, taking a moment to watch the world. He noticed the way the sunlight caught the edges of the buildings, the way shadows moved across the pavement, the small, unnoticed rhythms of life that had never held much importance for him. And yet he felt drawn to them now, as though noticing these small things was a kind of awakening. The little girl was not far from him. She was watching pigeons peck at crumbs on the ground, her eyes wide with curiosity and delight. Every so often she glanced toward him as if she remembered the brief connection they had shared. He wanted to approach her again, to speak, but he felt unsure. Adults rarely knew how to interact with children in moments like this, not without seeming strange or awkward, but he wanted to connect even briefly, in a way that felt genuine and uncalculated. He remembered her words, "Everyone needs kindness sometimes." The simplicity of it struck him harder than anything he had ever read in a book or heard in a meeting. He thought about the people he had passed by, the employees he had demanded more from, the friends he had pushed away, all because he had forgotten that the smallest gestures could have the biggest impact. He had been so focused on controlling outcomes, managing perceptions, and maintaining his image that he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered: human connection. He reached into his pocket and felt the small piece of food again. It was meaningless in itself, but the memory of the girl's smile and the innocence behind her gesture made it feel precious. He turned it over in his hand, thinking about how she had given it without expectation, without judgment. How rare that was. How powerful. He realized that he had been searching for something like that for years, though he had never understood it until now. He had sought respect, admiration, even fear, but he had never sought genuine kindness, and he had never received it in such a pure form from someone so small. So unaware of the power she held in that simple act, he looked around the square again, noticing families, friends, and strangers interacting, and he realized how disconnected he had been. He had spent years believing that wealth and influence would protect him, bring him comfort, and fill the emptiness he carried. But he had been wrong. All the money, all the power, all the accolades could not replace the simple need to be seen, to be understood, to be treated as a human being. The little girl laughed at something her parent had said, and the sound echoed in the square. It was pure and unforced, a sound that reminded him of the laughter he had once known but had long since lost. The sound made his chest tighten again. He felt a wave of emotion he couldn't suppress. He stood, holding the piece of food, and started walking slowly toward her. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he felt compelled to connect, to acknowledge the gift she had given him, not just the food, but the reminder that life could still hold unexpected beauty. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was appropriate to approach a child alone. But the feeling inside him was stronger than his doubts. He moved forward, careful not to startle her. As he approached, she looked up at him again, her eyes bright and curious. He stopped a few steps away, not wanting to crowd her space. He smiled gently, a smile he hadn't used in years because it felt too vulnerable. But vulnerability, he realized, was part of being human, part of being seen. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice trembling slightly, "for the food and for reminding me of something important." The girl tilted her head, sensing the seriousness in his tone. She didn't fully understand the weight of his words, but she understood enough to nod and smile. "You're welcome," she said. "Everyone needs it." He looked at her, really looked, and felt tears prick the corners of his eyes. Not the tears of weakness, not the tears of failure, but the tears of someone who had been reminded of the simplest truths he had forgotten, that life was more than power, more than status, more than success. It was about connection, about noticing, about kindness, about moments that seemed small but could change everything. He realized he didn't want to forget this moment, didn't want to bury it under the layers of his busy life. He wanted to carry it forward, to let it remind him that he could still feel, still care, still be touched by the smallest acts of generosity. He had been living in a controlled world of expectations and appearances, but the little girl had shown him that authenticity, even in the simplest forms, mattered far more as she turned back to her parent and continued on her way. He stood for a moment longer, watching her disappear into the crowd. He felt lighter somehow, as though the weight he carried had been lifted, if only slightly. The square around him seemed brighter, more alive, more real. He took a deep breath and looked at the piece of food in his hand again. It was not important by itself, but it symbolized a connection he had nearly forgotten how to feel. He carefully folded it and put it back in his pocket, a small token of a moment that had already begun to change him. He knew he would remember the little girl's eyes, her voice, her simple act of kindness for the rest of his life. And he knew that, in some way, she had awakened something in him that could not be undone. A gentle reminder that even the most powerful people could be moved, could be reminded of the beauty in the small, human things that often went unnoticed. The man walked out of the square slowly, letting the sounds of the city wash over him. He felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. He had gone there to pass a few minutes, but the encounter with the little girl had done something he hadn't expected. He was aware now, more than he had been in years, of the distance between himself and the world around him. Everything he had built, every achievement he had earned, suddenly felt less important than it had the day before. He had been reminded that the human heart was fragile, and that simple acts of kindness had a power far greater than money or influence. As he continued down the street, he noticed the way people interacted with one another. A young couple held hands as they walked, speaking quietly and laughing. A street musician played soft music, and a few people stopped to listen, tossing coins into the open case. He saw a small child helping a neighbor carry groceries. And for a moment he stopped, feeling a warm sensation he couldn't quite name. It was empathy, a feeling he had buried beneath years of responsibility and self-preservation. The piece of food the girl had given him still rested in his pocket. It wasn't important for its taste or value. It was a symbol of something much greater, a simple gesture that had carried meaning far beyond what anyone around them could understand. The man felt a sudden urge to act, to do something that reflected what he had learned in that brief, fleeting encounter. He found himself approaching a nearby cafe, one he had passed hundreds of times without entering. Today something pulled him inside. The aroma of coffee and baked goods was comforting, familiar in a way he had almost forgotten. He bought a small pastry and a cup of tea, not because he was hungry, but because it felt like a step toward participating in life again, toward noticing the simple pleasures that had once been part of his world. Sitting at a small table near the window, he watched people pass by. He observed a man struggling with a heavy bag, a young woman helping an elderly person across the street, children skipping along the pavement. He realized he had spent so long focused on schedules, deadlines, and accomplishments that he had missed these little acts of humanity, the moments that reminded him of what it meant to care for another person. He thought about the little girl again, about the courage it had taken for her to approach him. She had spoken with honesty and warmth, without expectation or fear, and in that, she had reminded him of the power of authenticity. He had spent so many years performing for others, controlling how he was perceived, that he had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist and be seen. Her small act had pierced through the layers of pretense and expectation he had built around himself. As he sipped his tea, he noticed a homeless man sitting on a bench outside, shivering in the cold. The man had never really paid attention to people like him before, not because he didn't care, but because he had been too focused on his own world. Today something was different. He felt a pull, a need to act. He walked outside and offered the man his pastry and tea, and the look of surprise and gratitude on the man's face struck him deeply. It was a simple exchange, yet it carried meaning that went far beyond the objects themselves. He continued walking through the city, noticing things he had long ignored. The laughter of children, the way sunlight reflected off windows, the gentle gestures people offered one another without thought. Each moment reminded him that life was full of small acts that mattered, and that sometimes the smallest gestures could have the greatest impact. He felt a strange lightness, as though the burden he had carried for years was slightly lifted. By the time he returned to his office, he felt different. Not changed in the ways that his colleagues would notice, not in his position or responsibilities, but changed inside. He carried with him a new awareness, a recognition that power and wealth were not the measure of life's value. It was the kindness, the attention, and the human connections that truly mattered. He thought about the little girl again. Her smile, her courage, and her honesty. She had reminded him that even the smallest heart could have a profound impact. That innocence and purity of intention had a power that could reach the hardest of souls. He realized that the encounter was not just a fleeting moment, but a turning point, a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Later, in a quiet room of his office, he looked at the piece of food the girl had given him, still in his pocket. It had lost all practical meaning, but its significance had grown in ways he could not measure. It represented a bridge between two worlds, the innocence of a child and the burdened life of a man who had long forgotten how to feel. He felt tears prick his eyes, the kind of tears that came from a place of gratitude and reflection. Rather than sadness, he began to think about the people he had ignored, the kindness he had overlooked, and the moments he had missed because he had been too focused on control and success. He realized that life was happening all around him, full of small, meaningful interactions, and that he had the opportunity to participate, to give, to connect, in ways he had almost forgotten were possible. The encounter with the little girl had opened something inside him, a door that had long been closed. He knew that he would never see her again, and yet the impact of her actions would remain with him. It was a reminder that the world still held goodness, that human connection could reach even the most hardened hearts, and that it was never too late to change the way he lived and interacted with others. He sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on the day, the girl, and the simple truth she had taught him. That life, no matter how busy or complicated, always had room for kindness, for attention, for connection. And in that realization, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. A quiet hope that he could live differently, more openly, more humanely, and more meaningfully. Days passed, but the memory of the little girl and her simple act of kindness stayed with the man. He found himself thinking about her more often than he expected, replaying the encounter in his mind. Each time, he remembered the warmth in her eyes, the honesty in her voice, and the way she had offered something so small yet so meaningful. It was as if a part of him, long buried under years of work and responsibility, had woken up, reminding him of what truly mattered in life, he began to notice his surroundings differently. Meetings that once felt like the center of his universe now seemed like small pieces of a much larger picture. He watched people interact, the subtle gestures of care and kindness, and felt a deep sense of appreciation for moments that had previously gone unnoticed. He found himself stopping to hold doors, offering a kind word to someone passing by, or listening just a little more closely when a colleague spoke. The lessons from the girl's act were guiding him in ways he hadn't anticipated. One morning, he decided to visit the neighborhood where the square was located. He wanted to see if he could understand the world she lived in, to experience the life outside the high-rise buildings, conference rooms, and constant meetings that had dominated his own existence. As he walked through the streets, he observed the everyday lives of people, the small struggles, quiet joys that made up ordinary living. The laughter of children, the greetings between neighbors, the careful way people cared for one another left a deep impression on him. He walked past a small playground and saw a child helping another up the slide after a fall. He paused and watched the simple act, feeling a sense of connection and gratitude. He realized how much he had missed by living in a world where speed and efficiency mattered more than compassion and attention. These small moments were powerful, more powerful than any deal he had ever closed or any decision he had made in his professional life. The man began to take steps to incorporate more kindness into his own life. He found ways to help people without expecting anything in return. He volunteered quietly, assisted neighbors in small ways, and made an effort to truly listen when someone spoke. These acts were not for recognition or image. They were genuine attempts to honor the lesson the little girl had given him. Every time he acted with kindness, he felt a lightness that had been absent for years, a reminder that even small gestures could have a profound impact. Months went by, and he often returned to the square hoping to see the little girl again. Though he never did, the effect she had on him remained. He carried the memory like a guiding light, reminding him of the value of empathy, sincerity, and human connection. He understood now that wealth and influence could not fill the spaces where compassion belonged. True fulfillment came from giving and receiving kindness, noticing the world around him, and recognizing the humanity in others. One afternoon, he encountered a situation that tested what he had learned. A woman had dropped her belongings on the street, and people hurried past without offering help. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and assisted her, helping to gather her things and offering a comforting word. The gratitude in her eyes mirrored the warmth he had felt from the little girl's act. He realized that these moments, small as they might seem, were shaping not only the lives of others, but also his own. Deepening his sense of connection and purpose, he began to share this newfound perspective with others around him, not in speeches or corporate meetings, but through genuine interactions. He encouraged acts of kindness within his company, creating an environment where people felt seen, heard, and valued. He found that when he treated others with care and empathy, it created a ripple effect that extended far beyond what he could control. People responded not because they had to, but because they felt inspired, reminded of the human capacity for goodness. One evening, he sat alone in his office, reflecting on the journey he had taken since that fateful encounter with the little girl. He realized that her simple act of kindness had opened a door he hadn't even known existed. It had reminded him that the world could still be beautiful, that humans had the capacity to care deeply, and that even someone with all the power in the world could be moved by genuine compassion. Tears came unbidden as he thought about how fragile and precious life could be. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the lesson she had unknowingly taught him. It was not just about the act itself, but about what it represented: the power of human connection, the importance of noticing, and the transformative potential of kindness. He understood that life would continue to challenge him, that pressures and responsibilities would remain. But he now had a new lens through which to view the world. He would approach each day with a greater awareness of the people around him, a willingness to offer help and attention, and a deeper appreciation for the small moments that truly mattered. Though he never saw the little girl again, she remained a part of him. Her courage, her innocence, and her sincerity had sparked a transformation that no amount of success or wealth could have achieved. He had learned that the most powerful changes often come from the simplest acts, that human connection is the truest measure of fulfillment, and that kindness, given freely, has the ability to heal, inspire, and awaken the heart. And so, he carried her lesson forward, letting it shape his actions, his decisions, and his understanding of the world. He became not just a man of influence, but a man of empathy. A man who had remembered how to feel, how to notice, and how to connect. In doing so, he found a sense of peace and purpose that had eluded him for years. A quiet joy rooted in the simple truth that even the smallest heart could change a life forever. Months had passed since that day in the square. Yet the memory of the little girl and her small act of kindness lingered in the man's mind like a quiet echo he could not ignore. Each morning, as he stepped into his office or walked through the city streets, he found himself observing people in a way he had never done before. He noticed the weary faces, the small gestures of generosity, the subtle connections between strangers, and he felt a pull in his chest that reminded him of the day everything had shifted. He carried a new awareness, a heightened sense of the human world that existed beyond his own walls of power and routine. One morning, he found himself walking near a community center, a place he had always overlooked. It was filled with children playing, volunteers organizing supplies, and families laughing quietly together. Something stirred inside him, a mix of curiosity and a desire to act. Without thinking, he stepped inside, unsure what he would do, but knowing he needed to be there. As he looked around, he noticed the way people worked together, supporting one another with patience and care. He remembered the little girl's smile, her courage, and her willingness to see him simply as a person. And he felt compelled to contribute in any way he could. He offered to help organize the supplies, not because anyone asked him to, but because it felt right. He watched children carefully as they unpacked boxes of books and toys, helping them place items where they belonged. Every smile, every thankful glance reminded him of the power of simple gestures, of being present, and of offering time and attention without expectation. The act itself was small, yet it gave him a satisfaction and warmth he had not experienced in years. It was not about recognition or status. It was about participating in the lives of others and feeling the humanity that bound them all together as he worked. He noticed a young boy struggling with a heavy bag of clothes. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and lifted it for the boy, placing it gently on the table. The boy's eyes lit up, and he whispered a small, shy thank you. That simple exchange, so ordinary to anyone else, struck the man deeply. He realized that life was full of these small, fleeting opportunities to impact someone else, and each one mattered more than he had ever understood. The little girl had reminded him of that truth, and now, as he experienced it directly, it resonated even more powerfully. Over the next few weeks, he made regular visits to the center. He began volunteering in more ways, helping children with their homework, assisting the elderly with organizing donations, and simply listening to stories that others shared. Each day, he felt a quiet transformation taking root within him. The heavy armor of control and authority that had defined his life began to soften. He realized that true influence did not come from power or wealth alone, but from the ability to connect with people, to notice their struggles, and to offer support and compassion. One afternoon, while arranging books in a small corner of the center, he overheard a conversation between two volunteers. They were discussing the challenges children faced at home: lack of support, insufficient food, and loneliness. He felt a pang of empathy, a deep sense of responsibility that had nothing to do with his professional obligations. He knew he had resources, knowledge, and the ability to make a difference. The memory of the little girl's act of kindness guided him, showing him that even the smallest contribution could ripple outward and create change. Inspired, began initiating small projects. He funded after-school programs, helped organize community events, and quietly provided support to families in need. Each act, though seemingly minor, carried the weight of genuine intention. He noticed the joy on the children's faces, the relief in parents' eyes, and the appreciation from volunteers. These moments brought him a sense of fulfillment far greater than any business achievement ever had. He had learned that wealth could facilitate kindness, but it could not replace it. Generosity had to be sincere, and it had to come from the heart. One rainy afternoon, he saw a girl struggling to cross a flooded street. Cars splashed past her and people hurried by, ignoring the situation. Without thinking, he stepped into the water, holding out his hand to guide her safely to the sidewalk. She looked up at him with wide eyes, and he smiled gently, echoing the kindness he had once received from another small hand. That brief interaction reinforced what he had come to understand. Every act of compassion, no matter how small, had the potential to change a life. As he continued his work, he began sharing his experiences with colleagues, not as a lesson or sermon, but as stories of real human connection. He encouraged them to notice the world around them, to recognize opportunities to help, and to appreciate the impact of even the smallest gestures. Slowly, the culture around him began to shift. People started looking beyond deadlines and profits, seeing the value in genuine care and attention. The lessons he had learned from a single encounter with a child had begun to transform not only his life, but the lives of those around him. He also noticed changes within himself that were subtler, quieter. He felt more patient in everyday interactions, more empathetic toward strangers, and more attuned to the emotions of those he encountered. Moments that would have once passed unnoticed, a smile, a kind word, a helping hand, now registered deeply. He cherished them. He realized that kindness was contagious, and by embodying it, he was inspiring others in ways that could never be measured by status or wealth. One evening, he found himself walking near the square where it all began. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the streets and buildings. He paused and looked around, remembering the little girl's smile, her courage, and the way she had reminded him of the power of simple, genuine human connection. He knew he would never see her again, and yet her impact was undeniable. She had opened a door in his heart, and he had walked through it, discovering a life richer and fuller than he had ever known. As he stood there, watching families, children, and neighbors going about their lives, he understood that the world was filled with opportunities for compassion, understanding, and care. It was a lesson he would carry forever, that one small act could ripple outwards, touching lives in ways that could never be fully known or anticipated. And he also understood that he had a responsibility, now more than ever, to pass that lesson on, to live with awareness, and to continue offering kindness wherever he could. He walked away from the square, feeling a sense of peace and purpose he had never experienced before. Life would continue to challenge him, as it always had, but he knew he had the capacity to meet those challenges with empathy, awareness, and care. He would not only live differently for himself, but for the countless others he could touch through small, genuine acts of kindness. The memory of the little girl would remain with him always. Her innocence, courage, and pure heart had shown him the path to something far more valuable than power or wealth. She had reminded him that the truest measure of a life well lived was not in achievements or accolades, but in the love, compassion, and care one offered to others. And in that realization he found the greatest transformation of all, the awakening of a heart that had once been closed, now open to the world, open to humanity, and open to the endless possibilities that kindness could create.